Welcome to the Henry Carter Hall Library. We're so pleased to have you join us here this evening, finally, for our presentation on the War of 1812. And we are grateful to our Clinton and Killingworth Historical Societies for putting together this effort. And of course, to our wonderful speaker, David LeVasseur. We are so pleased to have you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
And just very quickly before we start,
Yep.
I would like to extend a few invitations to other programs we have here at the library. You may have heard already about our Paddling Together program this summer. There's a lot to explore, but the spotlight is that you may now, with your library card from any town in Connecticut, borrow a pass that you can bring to the Indian River Marina about 6 minutes down the street and go paddle boarding or kayaking with 4 of your friends or family members for 2 hours. So it's a fun summer activity that we hope you'll take advantage of and a good reason to get a library card. In addition to that, we will be hosting a series of engaging events for all ages. The next one coming up, we are very pleased to welcome back to the library Darlene Kasich of the Institute for American Indian Studies, who will speak on her presentation, Quinatucket, Our Homeland, Our History. This will be a presentation on the indigenous peoples who resided in our local area and who still reside here today. So I hope you will join us for that. We do request registration Tuesday, July 9th at 5:30. All right. We also have some wonderful partnerships with the Clinton Human Rights Committee. They'll be back for their 3rd old-fashioned Chautauqua series starting July 10th. Lots of great programs in that 4-part series. I hope you'll pick up one of these or visit our website to learn more. And we also co-host a book club called Experiencing America. And this is a book club for adults that read stories that provide a contemporary American experience that is through a diverse lens. So it lends to very interesting conversation. We'd love to have you join us. There's plenty more to see and do, but today, of course, we are here for our presentation with David. Thank you very much again for being here tonight.
Thank you, everyone. And first of all, I want to thank all of you for your patience. I'm sorry we ended up having to postpone this from April, but certain things were beyond my control. So it is what it is when you get to be my age. So secondly, I would like to thank the Henry Carter Hall Library for hosting us, and Sarah in particular. She's been a godsend, because if we were relying on my technological skills, we'd be having clay tablets and
We'll say this now. We'll see how the night goes.
and also I would like to thank both the Clinton and Killingworth Historical Societies for sponsoring this talk too. It's really neat to see the 2 societies collaborate, since they were in fact one town up until 1838. And we have a couple of artifacts, one from each society here tonight. Over there is a musket we will talk about from the Clinton Historical Society. And over here is a militia coat from the Killingworth Historical Society. And both of them have great stories behind them. We'll talk about them a little bit later. So a couple of housekeeping details. I would ask everybody, including those folks on Zoom, to hold your questions until the end. And second housekeeping detail, the restrooms are there. And for those of you on Zoom, I don't know where your restroom is, but I'm hoping you do. So with that, let's get started. We're gonna, sure.
We will also invite everyone to take a moment to mute your cell phone if you haven't already. And then we're going to share.
Make sure I did that too. That'd be embarrassing, wouldn't it? Super. We are ready to rock and roll. All right, I'm going to have all of you put on your imagining caps, because this is going to be a really hard concept for you guys to grasp. But I want you to close your eyes and think about a period of time when this nation was so incredibly divided that governors violated rules laid down by presidents, didn't endorse foreign wars, and came close to seceding from the Union, long before the Civil War. That, my friends, is what the status of the United States was on the verge of the War of 1812. Now, you're wondering what caused the War of 1812, and depending upon which historian you talk to, they'll say anything from the Second American Revolution to typical American aggression against other parties. But the reality is, like most things, the truth lies somewhere in between. The real causes of the war were twofold. Number one is, while the British had agreed after the Revolution to give up any claims to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan and Wisconsin in that area, the reality was they spent the next 30 years making friends with the Native Americans that lived in that area, providing them with weapons, encouraging to raid the frontiers, and quite frankly, waged basically a war against Americans that were west of the Appalachian Mountains. So it was perceived as a very dangerous threat to the United States by those folks who lived in the western states and those folks who lived in the southern states. Because quite frankly, they actually encroached all the way down into Georgia and Alabama. So that lays out the groundwork for that. However, there was another real problem, and that was the notion of impressment of American sailors. The British had an annoying habit of coming up to smaller American ships and grabbing able-bodied seamen off of them, claiming they were still British citizens and impressing them into the British Navy. And why did the British do this? Well, they were kind of at war with Napoleon for like 20 years. And so they needed a strong Navy and they needed strong sailors. So they did that. Now, New England was extremely dependent upon trade with Great Britain at this point. In fact, Great Britain was their greatest trading partner outside of the West Indies. So you would have thought New Englanders would have been great and right on board with going to war against England about this, because it was their sailors being grabbed off the ships. It wasn't a sailor from Kentucky, I can assure you of that. But politics played a role. And the Federalist Party, which was the party of George Washington and John Adams, was firmly in control of New England. Whereas the South and the West were firmly under control of the, ready for this name, Republican Democrats, who were followers of Thomas Jefferson and his party. And James Madison was the president, and Congress decided they were going to go to war. And amazingly enough, not one member of the New England delegation voted in favor of the war. But it went further, because they also knew, the president knew, and the War Department knew, the only way they were going to win this war was to invade Canada. So a call went out to all the governors of the states for troops. And in those days, they had to mobilize the militia, and they would send the militia out of state to fight. And that required the permission of the governors. Well, the governor of Connecticut was a man by the name of John Cotton Smith, who, after seeing what the delegation did, told the president to go fly a kite. He wasn't allowing any militia from Connecticut to leave the state and fight in this, what they consider to be an illegal war. So we have this unique situation where we've got, at that time, 5 states, because Maine was still part of Massachusetts, basically thumbing their nose at the federal government. And normally that would have been disastrous at any time, but in time of war, it was particularly difficult for the administration to conduct a war. Despite that fact, 1,800 men from Connecticut volunteered to serve in the federal military and did march out of state in various units and sought to invade Canada and engaged in other military operations. That left Connecticut sitting here with a militia, and it really was not much of a need for it. Things were pretty quiet until 1813. In 1813, a squadron of United States naval vessels left New York City, bound for Boston. And they got about as far as Old Saybrook, when the main mast on the main ship, the frigate United States, broke. And the commander of that small fleet of 4 ships knew he needed to put into a deep water port so he could make repairs. He did, he put into New London. The problem with that was the British sent a squadron up, which was much larger, and they camped out basic in Gardiner's Island Bay for the next 3 years. So that anytime the Americans thought about coming out of New London, there would be a battle and the Americans would be outnumbered. So we have the unique perspective of the United States having a naval force sitting in a state that doesn't want to participate in the war, and a British squadron sitting offshore for basically 2.5 to 3 years. So that sets the stage for some interesting politics, and the British really didn't know how to deal with this situation, because they certainly didn't want to antagonize the New Englanders to the point where they supported the war. But at the same time, New Englanders had decided, particularly the shipping New Englanders, that it was very lucrative to become a privateer. Now, a privateer in 18th and 19th century terms was basically a legalized state pirate. But it wasn't just the states that issued letters of marque, it was also the federal government. And since the state itself wasn't terribly inclined to want to fight a war with Great Britain, I can assure you all these privateers went to Washington to get their letters of marque. They got them and they found the coves and rivers and harbors of Connecticut a lovely place to seek out the British merchant people and merchant ships and to take them, and they would get a share of the profits and proceeds. And I was given a story just before I started about an ancestor of one of your audience members who actually ended up making $17,000 as his share of the prize off of a privateer. So I don't have to tell you, New Englanders being who we are by our very nature, that was an extremely lucrative and safe business for quite a while. So 1812 was a quiet year in the Sound and then up and down the seaboard. 1813, it got a little dicey because we now have an American flotilla in New London. And the governor of Connecticut at the time, remembering full well what happened at New London and Fort Griswold 30 years before, decided he would put most of his efforts and militia efforts into defending New London, not because he cared about the ships of the United States Navy, but he did not want to see New London burned again. And he did not want to see tragedy strike the state of Connecticut. So virtually all of the able-bodied artillerists were sent over to New London. Now that would have been fine under normal circumstances, but we got this little thing called privateering going on. And the privateers were coming out of all sorts of harbors in the state of Connecticut and all up the Connecticut River and all over the place trying to sneak out of here. About the only place they didn't come out of was the greater New London area because they knew the British fleet was sitting right offshore. But they certainly snuck around some of the other byways and highways of Long Island Sound. And it should surprise none of you who know anything about boating that Clinton had the best harbor on the shoreline between New London and New Haven. So when ships were being chased by British ships, which the British finally began to crack down on privateering, the first place they would make for was Clinton Harbor, because if they could get over the sandbar, they were safe from the larger British ships. So it was really in 1813 and 1814 that the British began cracking down on privateers. And to be quite honest with you, we don't know exactly all of the attacks that took place and all of the instances that took place. But we know that most of them happened in 1814, because that's when the British began a general crackdown along the shoreline. They're probably most known for their attack on Essex in April of 1814, where they came up and burned virtually every ship they could get their hands on. I had a lovely breakfast brunch at the Griswold Inn and then retreated back down the river. The rumor at the time was that the militia from Clinton and Killingworth were the first ones on the scene to fight the British. And that was what led to this picture right here, which you saw as part of the promo for this talk tonight. This is abject and pure fantasy. The militia from Clinton and Killingworth did respond, but they didn't go to Essex. They wisely realized that by the time they got to Essex, the British would be back down the river. So they headed to the fort that was located in Saybrook. And we already know that that was deserted because when the British came up the river, the first thing they did was check out the fort, and there was nobody there and there were no cannons there because they'd all been stripped to send to New London and Groton. So this gentleman right here is Captain Amasia Bray. He was born in North Brantford. His father was a congregational minister there. We don't know anything about his schooling. We know he showed up in Clinton around 1810, and he married well. He married the daughter of the only general that lived in town, Joseph Wilcox, and he was the first lawyer in the two towns. He became head of the Masonic Lodge and was quite prominent in local politics. And he also got involved with the militia and ended up being the adjutant to a militia regiment that was based in artillery. And besides the scene being facetious, his uniform coat is facetious because the lapels on it would have been red for artillery. And like this coat here, this was clearly belonged to a gentleman who was in the militia and the artillery. And the infantry used to wear blue, light blue, and the cavalry wore yellow. So why they have him with a collar that's red and lapels that are yellow is beyond me, but they do. The story behind this painting is as interesting as the story of the burning of Essex itself. Most of what was known about the burning of Essex was complete hearsay that had been passed down through generations until some research was done by the Connecticut River Museum about 20 years ago. But the rumor at the time was that when the militia from Killingworth and Clinton marched, they came to Essex. So the fellow who owned the Griswold Inn at the time, William Winterer, a patron of the bar, painted several paintings of the Battle of Essex and included this one in the mix back in the 1950s. It has been said by some that it may have been to pay off a bar tab. We're not sure, but I'm sure it had something to do with it. So while it's a great painting, it's completely historically inaccurate. There were no gun positions in Essex. You see cannons firing there. And if there were cannons in Essex, they would have been on the old big type of wheeled vehicles because you can't tow one of those behind a horse very well. So now we're going to move up spot to this famous site. And most of you who have ever been to the town beach and down Waterside Lane have seen this. This was an artillery piece called a carronade. And of course, the story is that it was used to shoot at the British out in the harbor on the numerous occasions that they came down. The problem with that is a carronade was not designed for that. A carronade was designed to be on a privateer, and it was to be fired at close quarters like a shotgun. And the idea was to kill crew members and to also take the sails and the masts down of the opposing enemy ship. And that's why it's not on a rolling carriage, because it would have been virtually stationary on board the ship. So while it's a great story, and the story behind this one is particularly neat because it's said that it was captured by John Paul Jones off of a privateer during the American Revolutionary War. And it was on a ship that went aground at Saybrook Bar, Sandbar, and a captain from Clinton and Killingworth rescued the cannon and brought it here. But the stories about it being used to bombard British ships are highly unlikely because the range wouldn't have even really hit the town beach very far. So now this is the cannon on Waterside Lane. We don't know where this was used. It was used in the War of 1812. Again, if it was used here in town, it would have been on a different type of carriage. That's a ship's carriage designed to just roll around the deck of a ship. That's probably a 6-pounder. I'm not absolutely sure. It's a 6 or 8-pounder, and would have been used to fight against ship to ship usually, or
That one's
from
on
land.
Liberty Green, isn't it?
That's the one on Liberty Green.
Not Waterside Lane.
No, the other one was Waterside.
The other one is Waterside.
Again, I'd ask you to hold your questions till we get to the end. The interesting thing is, after the Essex raid, and in that August was the Stonington raid, the governor of Connecticut decided it was time to really reallocate some cannon to the shoreline, because there were none defending the shoreline from New London to New Haven. So he established a battery of 4 cannons, 2 brass 6-pounders and 2 iron 4-pounders. And they were based in Clinton, primarily because they could go in either direction, up and down the shore as needed. And the person selected to head that up was our good friend, Amasia Bray, who by this point was no longer an adjutant for the 2nd Artillery Regiment, but had been promoted to battery commander. And he was placed in charge of of Clinton Harbor and defending the fort at Old Saybrook. So Amasia took over his command and did that for a number of months in 1814. And then we'll get into the specifics of some of the attacks on the town, because that's an interesting thing too. There's a lovely sign down by the town beach that has a number of incidents and dates about when certain attacks occurred in the harbor. There's one that talks about July of 1813, when British ships chased a ship into the harbor and shots were fired and the British withdrew. In July of that year, it said that the British actually blockaded the harbor for a couple of days. And cannons were engaged to fire at them. Allegedly, again, 6-pounders. The interesting thing about this sign is it talks about the cannons being hauled to Hammock Point and also being used on Cedar Island. And I find it unlikely that they would have tried to lug one of these cannons into a boat and drag it over to Cedar Island, because you couldn't get there by land back in the early 1800s. So it's more likely that they probably stored the cannons in the Waterside Lane area so that they could deploy to either side of the harbor as needed. Plus, if you ever stood on the green where the Waterside Lane carronade is and looked out to the harbor, you realize that that one spot commands the entire entrance into the inner harbor. So that would have been the prime spot to put cannons. And they weren't about to put them out at Hammock Point and leave them, because the British would come ashore, spike the cannons, and then do whatever they wanted to do. So it was unlikely that they would have taken such a precious commodity and left it at risk, isolated out on Hammock Point. In September, a Haddam schooner was chased into the harbor by a British ship called the Alatanta, and it ran aground. And 4 boats were dispatched from the British ship, and shots were fired from the cannon, and the British retreated. And we know that that particular ship, British ship, was working in Long Island Sound in September, and it destroyed 15 small vessels. In November of that year, it is said that a schooner from Haddam, named the Experiment, was chased into the harbor by that ship and a ship called the Beaver. Well, we know the Atalanta was not around in November. It had been transferred to Nova Scotia and it burned to the ground up there in port. So on December 8th, there was a talk about another ship called the Tryon, captained by a John Ely, who also came into the harbor. And as you can see, there's a pattern here. People were trying to evade the British ships, and by doing so, they would come into Clinton Harbor, knowing it was a shallow harbor and the larger ships couldn't follow them in. And then the sign goes on to say that the final incident occurred on July 9th, 1814, and a ship called the Telegraph was chased by British ships, and again, she ran aground in the harbor. most of these ships were salvaged, so it was an interesting thing. Mesa Bray, as I said, held up the battery command and the post command for 4 months. And then later on, a Captain Lee Hurd was brought in, and he headed up the artillery unit for 2 months in December and November of 1814. It is said that there were at least 10 attacks on the harbor. Now, my source said between May and December of 1814, but I'm wondering how many of these other attacks were really at the same time, because in 1813, the British were still concerned with that fleet bottled up in New London. And at that point, privateering really hadn't taken an inroad into the economy here, and hadn't been so successful that they would have launched their raids. So my guess is most of these assaults constitute some of the 10 assaults that occurred in the research that I'd done that happened in 1814. Probably the most interesting attack was a Block Island boat, which is basically a whale boat with a sail. It had British sailors in it and British Marines, and they were seen off the coast of Clinton by a resident named Gideon Kelsey. Gideon lived in a house at the head of Waterside Lane. And he saw the British ship and headed to Hammock Point, and he brought 2 of his neighbors, a pair of brothers, Wilcox brothers, Silas and William, and they came along and stayed behind the sand dune and kept loading his gun and passing it up to him so he could keep shooting. And it is said that he shot 3 or 4 guys in the whaleboat before they got out of range. And years later, the boat docked in Clinton Harbor long after the war. And Gideon went down to look at it, and there were still bullet holes in the ship that had never been. But he was quite a character, and we'll talk a little bit more about his house, which is still standing today, and his tombstone. But I want to talk a little bit more about Mesa Bray, because he turned into quite the tragic character. His father-in-law and most of his wife's family migrated to Marietta, Ohio in 1810. And the general died out there in 1817. And it's said that at some point in time, Mesa and his family went out there as well. But they returned to Clinton in the late 18-teens, and his health was broken. There are 2 stories about it. One is that it was health alone, and other folks say he had a penchant for a flagon of grape now and again, and that may have been part of the problem. But the point is that his practice deteriorated. He was unable to support his family. He sought recompense and assistance from the statewide Masonic Lodge, and that was rejected. He wanted to relocate to a better climate for his health, he said. That was rejected, and he died in 1823 at the age of 42, and was so impoverished that his tombstone was paid for by the town of Clinton. But he is still buried in the Indian River Cemetery, and his stone still stands, which is pretty neat. But an interesting fellow and war hero who I don't believe was fully appreciated at the time, or certainly by history. So we talked a little bit about Gideon earlier. This is Gideon's house. You've probably seen it a bajillion times driving to the town beach, because it's roughly across the street from where the cannon's located on the green on Waterside Lane. And finally, there's Gideon's tombstone. So let's see what else we can talk about. The Hartford Convention, because this really brings closure to all of this. About this time, the powers that be, and particularly in the Federalist Party that were inland, were tired of the war. They were tired of the demands made on the economy by having to bring up militia and pay for cannons. I mean, the interesting thing is the governor had told the president to go pound sand when he wanted volunteers to leave the state. Well, he had the audacity to ask the president deploy troops to Connecticut to help defend it. And I can assure you that the president did not respond with a, "We'll be right there." So it's interesting that, as I said, the politics don't always change in this country dramatically with time. But anyway, the Federalists in Connecticut began talking with the Federalists in other New England states. And they came to the conclusion that they were sick of the war and they wanted it to end. So they put together a convention that met in Hartford in December of 1814. And on the agenda was to withdraw from the United States of America. To my knowledge, the first organized attempt to do that, and it certainly predated the Civil War by quite a few years. The only thing that stopped them was two things. Number one, indignation against the war and against the British was growing, particularly after the burning of Washington in August and September of 1814. And we were already engaged in the peace treaty negotiations over in Ghent. So the interesting thing was that in early 1815, the United States scored its biggest military victory of the war at the Battle of New Orleans, where we wiped out an entire British invading army, killed their commanding general, killed their second in command, killed their third in command. And it was done by a mix of regular soldiers, Tennessee woodsmen, pirates, and a number of other miscreants and malcontents that could carry a weapon and fire a cannon. And under the auspices of Andrew Jackson, which of course made his political career. Well, when word got through about the time of that great victory, it was about the time that news came in that the peace treaty had been signed. And it kind of left the guys in Hartford in kind of a lurch because they would look pretty stupid succeeding from the Union over a war that had just ended and that most people thought we just won. So the convention sort of melted away into the woodwork, and with the exception of a few knuckleheads like me that actually read about this stuff, it's largely forgotten to history. So we talked a little bit about Gideon's rifle over there. If it looks strange to you and it doesn't look like a military weapon, that's because it's not. It's what New Englanders would have called a fowler. And it was specifically used for shooting waterfowl in the fall. And it's particularly long, it's longer than a regular military weapon. And in view of the fact that it was a smooth bore, you needed that extra length to get any degree of accuracy. So the fact that Gideon would use a fowler to shoot at the British makes complete sense. The other thing that's interesting about that gun is that's not the original firelock mechanism on it. That's a percussion lock that was put on sometimes after the 1830s. And whatever happened to the original, we don't know, but obviously that meant Gideon and some of his ancestors continued to use it after they fired at the British ships. As for this coat, I mentioned it belonged to Jabez Lane. Jabez was the grandson of someone who's much more famous in Killingworth history. His grandfather was Captain John Lane, who was a militia officer during the French and Indian War. Except he never really got to serve in the French and Indian War, because in their annual military militia training day, he lined his troops up. He asked them to load their guns with powder, but no ball. And then he went down range to see how they looked. And unfortunately for Captain Lane, at least one person didn't follow his instructions and inserted a musket ball in his weapon. And when they fired in unison and the smoke finally cleared, Captain Lane was laying dead on the ground with a bullet between his shoulder blades. So they never found out who shot him. No one came forward. And the rumor was that he wasn't terribly popular because they didn't even do an investigation into who may have shot him. They tried to finger a fellow who had just moved to town from Saybrook. He denied it till the day he died. That's one of the great mysteries of Clinton Killingworth history that we'll never know. But this was worn by his grandson, probably in the 1890s and early 1800s, 1790s and 1800s, prior to the War of 1812, but the uniforms were almost identical. Because as you can imagine, in times of peace, a lot of money wasn't spent on the militia. So they were expected to make do with what they were issued for years and years and years. And If there's anything else I wanted to cover, that's pretty much it. So. Yeah. Well, we can open that up for questions. Sarah, if you want to do the adjustments, so. That's a great painting though, isn't it? That's something John Wayne would be. Here we go. Questions?
Where is the painting? I'm gonna turn the lights on.
The painting was at the Connecticut River Museum for many, many years, until they did research and realized that it was inaccurate. And then they pulled it down. There's also another painting, British burning ships. And they pulled that painting down too, and they put up a massive mural that was dedicated in, I want to say, around 2010. And these were sitting, an interesting story on the painting. I had seen that painting 30 or 40 years ago, and I knew it was there. And I went up to try to get a picture of it. And I was told by everybody at the Connecticut River Museum, we don't know what you're talking about. And I said, I can picture it. So it's got a Mesa Bray right in the front. It's got cannons shooting at British ships. And he's head of the Killingworth militia. And I know that painting was here. And he said, well, it's not here now. So I said, all right. And I said, well, if I was a painting, where would I go? I wasn't here anymore. So I went to the Essex Historical Society. I'm still waiting to hear from them. I went to the Grizz, because I thought, maybe it went back to the Grizz, since it was owned by them to begin with, and if these folks decided they didn't want it, a lot of folks, when their displays aren't being put up there, they want the property back. So I went to the Grizz, and the Grizz didn't have it. So about a week and a half, 2 weeks went by, and I got an email from the woman I'd spoken to, who's the curator of the Connecticut River Museum. She said, is this the painting you're talking about? And it turns out they did have it in their collection. I was able to get a copy of the painting and use it for our presentation tonight, so.
And do they have the one who painted?
His name was Kip Solwadell, and he titled it The Revenge. And again, we don't know if that had to do with paying off his bar tab or whether the actual attack on Essex. Kelvin?
Yes, you mentioned basically the handicapped squadron that was shanghaied into New London and was tied up there with a much larger British squadron holding it there for the duration of the war, I guess, for the next two or 3 years. What was it about that decapitated squadron, that small squadron, that made it worth it to the British to tie up a squadron for 3 years on that?
I think it was more or less because the British could spare the assets. At that particular point in time was a quiet period in the Napoleonic Wars, and the British really didn't have, the British had already taken command of the seas in Europe after Trafalgar in 1805. So the need for having a huge British fleet in Europe was no longer there. So the one arm of the military they could spare to send to the colonies was the Navy. And they were all second-rate ships, but second-rate ships were still better than a very few first-rate ships. So, but that's why they did that, and they also used it to enforce, as I said later on, they enforced the privateering rules as well up and down the coast. And, which it must have really torn the British, because on one hand, they wanted to stop privateering, but on the other hand, they clearly knew that that was driving the local merchants into the arms of their enemies and unifying it. As a matter of fact, the Clinton Historical Society has a letter written by the residents of Clinton and Killingworth to Hartford saying that you're in favor of this war now by 1814. So they were sick and tired of the attacks along the shoreline. John?
As you know, there's a couple of lane houses on Shore Road. Would that be related to?
Yes, I don't know which one was his.
That would have actually been his, one of those?
I don't know, because a couple of them have fallen down. His grandfather's house is gone. but there were plenty of other lanes in that district, hence the name Lane District. But which ones are, if any of them are his, I don't know. I don't know if he built his own house. I don't know if he inherited one from his parents. I just don't know. And quite frankly, I wasn't even able to find much reference to a war record for him. He was born in the 1760s, so he probably wouldn't have participated actively in the War of 1812. By then he probably would have been retired, but he certainly would have been active in the militia in the 1790s and early 1800s. Any other questions?
We can also invite our virtual friends if you'd like to ask a question.
Yes, hi, David. It's Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer.
How are you?
Good. How are things down on the Cape?
They are lovely, nice and cool and sunny.
No
And
British
I
ships offshore.
Yes. And I have enjoyed the presentation, and I did have a question because I a while ago read The Battle of Stonington. And so that happening around the same time as all of this. And my understanding from the ship that was the British ship that was off of the New London Stonington area was that whole area and those ships, I mean, it really clogged off any of the American ships trying to come up out of Long Island Sound by having some British ships that, as you say, were second class, but they had more of them and could effectively cut off any American activity heading out into the Atlantic to go down to New York the other way.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is because Connecticut wasn't enthusiastic about the war, it never bothered to raise its own navy as it had during the Revolutionary War. So there were no, other than federal naval ships in the London Harbor, there really wasn't a navy to contend with the British. So they had pretty much free reign up and down Long Island Sound and off the coast and all the way up to Boston.
Yeah. Yeah. Not much support for the poor Americans.
Thank you, Jennifer. Do we have any other virtual questions tonight?
Sure. Can you hear me? Bob Bischoff.
Hi, Bob. How's it
Hi
going?
there. Doing good. I love this presentation. I discovered at one time in the Clinton Historical Society records, they have a petition that was apparently put forward in the town I believe it didn't have a date on it, but it was a list of all of the prominent members, prominent citizens of the town. And it was originally thought it was a letter in support of the American Revolution. But it looked, when I found it and looked it over, it looked like it was a group of citizens who, although they did not support the war particularly, they figured once you were in it, you're in it. And they were expressing their opposition, it sounded like, to the Hartford Convention. So I think it'd be really fascinating if someone had the inclination and the time to take a look at this document. It's in the library, I think, at the Flynn Library, and then see all the list. I mean, that Lady Hurd and the whole list of prominent citizens of 1814. So it might be of interest to anyone that like that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, it is. As a matter of fact, it's in the same glass case that the Gideon Kelsey's musket is normally kept in. It's actually separated out of the paperwork because it was considered to be important enough of an artifact to be as part of the display. So that was the letter to which I was alluding, that while they weren't enthusiastic about it, I think they were more concerned with the Hartford Convention.
Yeah, the Hartford Convention. Yeah.
Therefore, they felt that they needed to weigh in and say that they were opposed to that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And of course, they were also appreciative of the fact that the state of Connecticut had finally sent them some cannon to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
Perhaps that's also a segue. Would we like to share a little information about our historical societies in the Clinton Historical Library?
Sure, I can do a little bit about that. Anne had asked me to mention the fact that the Clinton Historical Society has a museum room in the town hall. It's open Thursdays from 5 to 7. And you folks can go in there and see this weapon and the powder horn. We don't know if the powder horn goes with the weapon or not, but it's certainly of the same time period, so it's likely that it could have. But you folks are welcome to come in on Thursdays from 5 to 7 when the museum room is open. So, and then I'll defer to Killingworth to talk about any activities they want to promote.
Well, we have open houses at Parmalee Farmhouse. Throughout the summer, they will be on our website and on Facebook. And we're going to be working on our barn exhibits, so in August, that will be open as well, and into September. So we invite everyone, whoever would like to come, we'd love to have you and see what northern old Killingworth looks like and our artifacts. And thank you, Jane, for including and inviting us to this.
Well, thank
I'd
you.
also like to mention that we are on Connecticut Collections now. And if you want to go on to the website, it's connecticutcollections.org, and just put in Killingworth and you'll see what we have archived at this point. We have a long way to go, but we do have some items online. So for anybody who's interested, we invite you to take a look.
I also want to put in a plug. If you loved 1812, you're going to love 1824 when Lafayette came back to the US for his farewell tour. You've probably all seen the lovely historic marker in front of the brick house. And so around August, is it August 21st? Around August 21st, yeah, August 21st is when he came through here. There might be a little event going on in Clinton. We're not doing anything in current President Killingworth, but if you want to see what's going on starting in New York in mid-August, all the way for 13 months, go to Lafayette200.org. And there's all sorts of information from the American Friends of Lafayette. And if you want to talk to me after, I'm on the board of the American Friends of Lafayette, and have been involved in the planning of this. We have a travel app. If you're going to certain areas where Lafayette was, you can follow along like that. And I'll stop giving the plug now, but that's, I want you all to know about that because it's coming up and it's going to be exciting. It was a big, it got our divided country a little bit more patriotic just ahead of the 50th anniversary. That was the point of Monroe inviting him back. So, okay, that could be its own program. But I'll stop.
And then the only other thing I would mention about the Killingworth Historical Society is they have some really neat things in their collection that you don't see every day. For instance, my favorite thing is they have their original town hearse from the 1870s. It's been completely restored and can be viewed in their barn at the Parmalee Farm. They also own a portrait of Killingworth's very first minister, William Seward, that was painted by his daughter in the 1760s. And we believe that she probably got her art instruction from the wife of the minister of Haddam, who actually painted the first scene of the Connecticut River Valley in the 1750s, and it's can be viewed at the Connecticut Historical Society in Hartford. It's a really, really neat painting, and the earliest one in Connecticut River Valley. There isn't another one for 100 years after that, so it's kind of neat.
If I may also add a plug, your library card will also grant you access to some of our state's lovely museums. You may visit the Essex River Museum and learn about some of these histories there. And our friends at the Connecticut Museum in Hartford have wonderful resources too. They recently underwent a renovation. Lots of other good museums, but those two particularly relevant tonight. Any other questions for our speaker today? Or the societies?
Just a quick, I'm just wondering what your background is. I mean, you seem like a professor or something, or a teacher. You know, I just was curious.
You're about as far a mark as you can be. I started out as a lawyer, and then I was first selectman of Killingworth for 6 years.
Okay.
Then I went to work for the state of Connecticut, but I was a history major in college. I've been addicted to local history since I was a kid. And I tried to find out information about my parents' house on Ironworks Road because there was an old mill there. But I was unable to find out anything, so that taught me to, learn to go into the land records, so. So that's my background.
Thank you.
There was one more question here. Did you have a question?
The Historical Society, Clinton Historical Society was gifted a cannonball, oh, maybe 6, 7 years ago. That supposedly came off of a large British ship. Are you familiar with the cannonball and do you know anything more about it?
They have a collection of cannonballs in the historical room.
Right,
I don't know if they're all from the War of 1812 or whether they were from previous wars because Clinton Harbor did sustain some attacks on the British during the Revolutionary War as well. And the British were known to have fired cannonballs at the town then too, so. It's, you know, they didn't put dates on them, so it's tough to tell. And the manufacturing is pretty much the same as wrought iron.
yeah.
They were pretty crude.
This is about an 8 inch or pretty big.
Yeah, well, there's from that size all the way down to grape shot.
Yeah,
So they've got 4-pounders, 6-pounders, 8-pounders, 12-pounders, all the way up, so.
So an 8-pounder could be fired what distance?
A good 1,500, well, to be accurate, a good 1,500 yards. Yards.
Hmm.
That was a really pushing the bounds, but that's what they use it for. And then the reason is, if you know anything about ballistics, it's a function of the amount of gunpowder and the weight of the object being hurled. And so because they use that against larger ships, it had to be able to have a lot of stopping power and hence the range, because it needed to be able to strike ships. Because if a ship had a 32-pounder on board, it could hit you a lot sooner than you could hit it with an 8-pounder. Cynthia,
Dave, the little house that's on Waterside Lane, I believe it's on Waterside Lane,
yep,
is it the artillery? Is it
the arsenal.
Arsenal.
Yep.
Could you give us a little, history behind it and what war that was used for?
I'm not sure, and I've never actually seen a history for it. I do know that it was supposedly built in 1675, which would put it at the time of King Philip's War. And I know that at least 11 men from Clinton and Killingworth went off and served in that war because their reward for service in that war was given land grants in the two towns after the war was over with in 1689.
How much land would that be?
You know, I'm not absolutely certain, but it would have been in the northern, it would have been in the Killingworth part of town. And it would have depended upon whatever, I don't know off the top of my head. But there probably would have been several acres. Because at that point, we still had proprietors running the town and they were in charge of the land distribution. And normally they were done when proprietors decided more land needed to be allocated to accommodate the growing population. But in this particular instance, it's the only instance I'm aware of where the proprietors actually voted this bonus for people who served in the military, which I think is pretty unique. But if you know anything about King Philip's War, you know that that was one of the few wars where the Native Americans almost won. New England was very small in terms of its European population, and the Indian tribes unified, and the war went on for quite some time before the English finally got the upper hand, and quite frankly, wouldn't have gotten the upper hand without the help of the Mohegan tribe.
Any last questions from our virtual guests?
What would the weight of that rifle be over there?
I don't know, I didn't weigh it. My guess is probably about 11, 12 pounds. Because it wouldn't have been as heavy as a military weapon because it would have been used for civilian purposes. The whole game plan behind that was not accuracy, but distance. And so they're all smooth bores, whether you're talking about military or you're talking about a follower. But the additional length of the barrel meant that the shot pattern would be more accurate further out. And so that's why most New Englanders who live by the shore had fowlers. And that was a perfectly acceptable militia weapon. If you were in the militia, if you showed up with your fowler, that was considered to be just as satisfactory as a regular military weapon, so. Okay.
Thank you.
Right on.
Thank you.
Thank you again, everyone.